Good morning. My name is Ivo Dalder. I'm the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here, and particularly Prime Minister Scott Morrison, to Chicago and to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. For almost a century, 98 years in fact, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and an active U.S. engagement in the world. And we're so glad to be able to do that once again this morning. Before we begin our program, I would like to offer a warm welcome to the esteemed members of the Prime Minister's delegation, as well as the members of the Diplomatic Corps who are here with us today this morning. And a special thanks to the Prime Minister's staff, as well as the staff of the Australian Embassy in Washington and the Australian Consulate in Chicago to help put this event together. Following the Prime Minister's speech, I will return to the stage and we will engage in a conversation, and we will also of course, take your questions if you would do so through our app. You can submit your questions by typing ccga.live into your browser and ask your question in that way. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to our guest of honor, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. He was sworn in as Australia's 30th Prime Minister in August of 2018 after being elected leader of the Liberal Party of Australia. He was first elected to Parliament as the federal member for Cook in 2007. He served during his more than 10 years in Parliament, he served in 3 additional senior cabinet portfolios. He was Treasurer, Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, and Social Services Minister. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree with honors in economic geography from the University of New South Wales. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivo, and thank you all for coming out here this morning. The Council is a 98-year-old organisation that has stood for the opportunity to come from whatever your perspective, and today I come from the Australian perspective, and to contribute some of our thinking on what is a very complex world at the moment and where Australia sees its role in it, and particularly our relationship with the United States. And so this is a great opportunity. There's a whole bunch of things going on in New York at the moment, but I know there's a lot of things going on in here in Chicago. So we wanted to be here in Chicago to be part of this discussion here as well. And it's wonderful to be here and to address this body. And I want to thank Ambassador Hockey for being here and Ambassador Culverhouse for being here. They've been doing a great job in managing the relationship that we have with AB down there in Canberra, and Joe, who's been here now for some years, and he's been doing a great job. And David Bushby, who's our new Consul General, and he's just taken up the role here very recently here in Chicago, and we're looking forward to the great work he's going to be doing. It was a little over 120 years ago that Teddy Roosevelt gave a memorable speech titled The Strenuous Life. Many of us in politics know it well. And it said that and it was done at the Hamilton Club, which is just a few blocks from here in Chicago. And on that day in 1899, he told his audience that the 20th century looms before us big with the fate of many nations. He said that if we are to be a really great people, the United States, we must strive in good faith to play a great part in the world. He added, far better to do and dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much or suffer much, because they live in the grey twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. Now, he preached not a life of ease, but one of strenuous endeavour. In Australia, we put it this way: if you have a go, you should get a go. And that's a theme I've used to describe my own government's approach to encouraging Australians to pursue their own individual aspirations. And I'm sure TR would probably not mind that reference. Without a spirit of enterprise, of endeavour, of aspiration, no nation will deliver security, economic prosperity and national unity to its people. And a guiding principle of mine is that regardless of our ability, our size or our circumstances, we are here to make a contribution, not just take one. That's actually what fairness means in Australia. There's the principle of mutual obligation, and it applies at nations levels as well. It's also how we approach our alliance relationships and how we build a strong economy and a secure nation, how we provide for our families and enable them to contribute to their communities as well. So against that backdrop this morning, I want to cover three themes. First, I want to spell out what our approach as a nation is of strenuous endeavour and what that means for the great alliance we have with the United States. Second, I want to explain what it means for the approach that we will take to the new and more challenging global environment that confronts us all. And thirdly, I want to talk a bit about Australia's place in the global economic landscape and how we are ensuring that Australia is well positioned to succeed in what is a rapidly changing global economy. Now, the importance of our alliance on this first point was set out in 1908 when our nation as a Commonwealth was only 7 years old. Australia's second Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin, defied our principal ally, Great Britain, at the time, and he wrote directly to President Roosevelt, inviting the Great White Fleet to visit Australia. Deakin wrote that no other federation in the world possesses so many features in common with the United States as does the Commonwealth of Australia. President Roosevelt's Secretary of State strongly recommended that Australia be added to the fleet's itinerary, and he told the President, "The time will surely come, although probably after our day, when it will be important for the United States to have all ports friendly and all causes of sympathy alive in the Pacific." That was a long-sighted view, and it's proved to be true. The fleet certainly received a friendly welcome in the Port of Sydney, which is Joe and my hometown. On the 20th of August of 1908, it is said that well over 500,000 Sydneysiders turned out to watch the arrival of the fleet. We saw at the Pentagon just this week a shot of that scene. Now that's quite a turnout for a city whose population at the time was only 600,000. That was a big crowd. It was the largest gathering yet seen in Australia, far exceeding the numbers that had celebrated even the foundation of our Commonwealth as a nation just 7 years before. Now that visit was the beginning of a strong, enduring partnership between our nations, and we've been alongside each other in every conflict since. We've always been prepared as Australians to make a contribution to that alliance and that relation, not just take one. And as a result, you do that over 100 years and more, your alliance only gets stronger and stronger to the point where it is today. Our public support for alliances like ours is incredibly strong. And your council's own survey, as we were just discussing outside, of public attitudes to foreign policy, published early this month, found support for America's security alliances has never been higher. And we welcome that. You can be assured that we are determined to continue to expand and strengthen our alliance. On this visit, we have agreed to increase our cooperation in space research. Now, this isn't about Australian writing cheques to NASA or anything like that. This is about Australia as a Commonwealth investing in our own businesses in Australia, our own capability in Australia, to create jobs in Australia, in our space industry, so our space industry can participate in the noble and visionary project of the return to the moon. Not about writing cheques to NASA. NASA's got plenty of cheques. But the Australian industry needs to develop. And this is about, frankly, it's about 20,000 jobs in Australia and turning an industry in Australia into a $12 billion industry by 2030. And so that industry in Australia can partner and participate with commercial partners here in the United States. And we're also working together to build an integrated supply chain on rare earths and critical minerals. This is both a strategic as well as an economic issue for Australia, essential for our defence and high technology applications. And we are deepening cooperation on so-called frontier technologies that will shape the global economy for decades and beyond, very much in both our national interests. We are substantially increasing our economic, security and infrastructure cooperation in the Southwest Pacific. We are modernising our alliance cooperation arrangements. And the bottom line is that we made a commitment to the alliance, we meant it. and we will never take it for granted. Because there is a temptation and a great danger in complacency around alliances. To welcome the protections that are provided by them, but not necessarily the obligations. It's a temptation that thankfully our nations have meticulously resisted and continue to. We are committed to working with the United States internationally because we agree it has borne too many burdens on its own. Australia will continue to pull its weight. We look to the United States often, but we don't leave it to the United States. We do not opt for the grey twilight. We do not shrink from strife. The challenges of a changing world are things we confront. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are grappling with the end of one era now, and really what is the dawn of the other, another. Like TR more than 100 years ago, we confront a changing economic order and transformative technological change. This isn't fresh news. Like TR, we should approach this challenge with confidence, resolve, and clearly articulated principles to guide us. And this is the central focus of what my government and what Australia is doing in the Indo-Pacific. It's the region where we live. It's our neighbourhood. It's the region that will continue to shape our prosperity, our security, our destiny, and increasingly a global balance of power. Our engagement with the Indo-Pacific will be shaped by 5 key principles. Firstly, a commitment to open markets and the free flow of trade based on rules, not power. Respect for sovereignty of nations, their independence, irrespective of their size, from the smallest Pacific nation to one of the greatest and largest economies in the world. A commitment to burden sharing with strong and resilient regional architecture, respect for international law and the settlement of disputes, and a commitment to work together to resolve challenges of common interests, including, particularly, on our oceans. We're the biggest island continent in the world. Our oceans impact heavily, not just on our economy, on our security, but how we do life in Australia, and always have, not just in modern times, but going down over 60,000 years of the oldest living culture in the world, our Indigenous Australians. Oceans, climate, illegal fishing, and plastics pollution, practical issues that need addressing. We also need to work together to find ways to reduce trade tensions that have developed over recent years. China's economic growth is welcomed by Australia, and we recognise the economic maturity that it is now realised as a newly developed economy. This was the point of the world's economic engagement with China. Having achieved this status, it is important that China's trade arrangements and participation in addressing important global environmental challenges like the ones I just mentioned, that there is transparency in their partnerships and support for developing nations. All of this needs to reflect this new status and the responsibilities that go with it as a very major world power. The world's global institutions must adjust their settings for China in recognition of this new status. That means more will be expected, of course, as has always been the case for nations like the United States, who have always had this standing in the world today. So it's also true that China's economic expansion, though, was made possible by the stability underwritten by US strategic engagement and the international community who built the global trading system and welcomed China's accession to the WTO. We should remember that it was 75 years ago at Bretton Woods that the United States led the way in the creation of financial institutions and economic forums that established equitable rules to stabilise the international economy and remove the points of friction that had contributed to 2 world wars. That was the dividend of peace. And investing that dividend of peace in a new world order. I agree with the assessment made in the President's 2017 National Security Strategy that while the economic global system continues to serve our interests, it needs need some reform. We cannot pretend that rules that were written a generation ago remain appropriate for today. Why would that be true in this area and not in any other? It's clear that global trade rules are no longer fit for purpose, and in some cases the rules were designed for a completely different economy in another era, one that simply doesn't exist anymore. In other cases, our rules are just not comprehensive enough, and it's clear that our rules are not keeping pace with technological change that is happening at an unprecedented pace. But we do need the rules. We do need the rules. A study by Accenture estimated that digital commerce now drives 22% of the world economy. We know these figures. A separate study by McKinsey Global Institute showed that data flows grew by a factor of 45 in the decade to 2016. But there are many existing obstacles and many emerging barriers to the expansion of the digital economy. Left to proliferate, such barriers will distort, choke the global economy and the great benefits that can flow to all nations. That's why Australia is taking a leading role in developing e-commerce rules at the WTO. That's a practical thing to do. There is a broader imperative at work, and we must demonstrate that collectively we have not lost our ability to adapt and adjust our trading system to new realities. When there were 144 members of the WTO, the Director General at the time likened the WTO to a vehicle that had one accelerator and 143 brakes. We cannot allow that to continue. We can no longer move at the speed of the lowest common denominator. It is time for the system to catch up with the world. And we intend to help that process in a practical way, making our contribution based on our experience. But I've got to say, we're positive about it. The world has just reached a change point. That's all. There's no need to catastrophise it. There's just a need to understand it and work together to adjust the institutions and the rules to accommodate it. There's no need to engage in a heavily polarised debate on this issue. There's a much more practical issue at the heart of all this. And we just have to reset to ensure that that can provide the same peace, stability and prosperity that happened last time. We're totally up to it. We still have the wit and the wisdom and the capability to achieve it. And so, Australia won't be a bystander in that process. We'll be involved. We'll be rolling our sleeves up. We'll be playing our part. And just in case you think we're doing that because we're just terribly wonderful, friendly, affable people, which we are, by the way, the real issue is it's in our national interest. The reason we're here today, it's a great council, it's a great institution. I'm here today because 1 in 5 Australian jobs depends on trade. And our connection with the rest of the world depends on that. I'm here today because what's happening with plastics in our oceans is bad news for our local environment back in Australia. So we need to do stuff about it. I'm here today because of our friends in the Pacific and our family in the Pacific. People are stealing their fish. That's got to stop if they want to have a secure future for their families and for their people. And these issues are the things that move the dial on all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the third point I want to talk about today. TR was right when he said in this city 120 years ago that no country can long endure if its foundations are not laid deep in the material prosperity that comes from thrift, from business energy and enterprise. Australian government understands this point very acutely, and my own government is unashamedly pro-growth. Every time the issue of inclusive growth comes up, I say, well, you've got to have growth first for it to be inclusive. And there is a simple reason for our view. Without a strong economy, you cannot provide your citizens with the living standards they aspire to, the essential services they rely on, the protection and conservation of the environment they live in, and the security under which they wish to shelter. And that is why my government will always seek to promote and reward enterprise and aspiration. And I think this is one of the great connection points between Australia and the United States. And we've talked a lot about it during this trip. The Australian economy is now in its 29th year of uninterrupted economic growth. That's a world record. I think it's one of our nation's greatest achievements, if not our greatest achievement. Since 1992, Australia's economy has grown faster than any other developed country in the world. And we are determined to build an even stronger economy. Most recently, we've legislated $158 billion in personal tax cuts because we believe Australians should keep more of what they earn, and that acts as an incentive for them to get out and realise their aspirations. It's record tax relief also for small and medium-sized businesses, similar to what you've achieved here in the United States. This year, our budget will be in surplus for the first time in 12 years. The Ambassador knows a lot about that too. He did a lot of the heavy lifting as part of our government in its early days to get to that result. We will eliminate net debt in its entirety within the decade by bringing the budget back to surplus. Our AAA credit rating remains in place despite the tremendous shocks we've had to our economy. Most significantly, and I'm not talking about the GFC, I'm talking about the end of the mining investment boom in Australia, ripped $80 billion of capital investment out of our country. Now that put quite a shock through the system, far greater than the impacts of the global financial crisis, which was of more acute effect in the North Atlantic. In Australia, the big hit to our economy actually came through that event, but yet we retained our AAA credit rating through that process, one of only 10 nations in the world to achieve this outcome from all key ratings agencies. We are pursuing the most ambitious trade strategy in Australia's history. In the last 6 years, we have secured duty-free or preferential access to an extra 1.7 billion consumers. 70% of Australia's two-way trade is now covered by free trade agreements, up from just 26% when our government came to office in 2013. We have concluded or are negotiating trade agreements with 17 of our top 20 trading partners. Australia gets it. You don't get rich in Australia selling things to yourself. You've got to take it offshore. You've got to take your economy offshore, and you've got to look outward for our prosperity, and we've been doing that for a long time. So that's why we're negotiating an ambitious FTA with the European Union and hope to commence negotiations with the United Kingdom as soon as it leaves the EU. And these efforts are paying dividends. In the year to June 30, Australia recorded a record trade surplus of around 50 billion Australian dollars. That's more than 3 times larger than the previous record. Despite global headwinds, Australia's recorded 19 consecutive monthly trade surpluses. And I hasten to add that the United States continues to enjoy a healthy bilateral trade surplus with Australia of some $29 billion in 2018. And just in case you were wondering, the US has had a trade surplus with Australia since the Truman administration. So there is no better deal than the one the US has with Australia. Not a tariff on anything that comes in. That is the gold standard of trade relationships that I think set out where Australia sits in the broader economic landscape with the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, our strong economy means we can plan for the future, and we will maintain a defiant optimism in the complex and often confusing world that is out there. Why? Because we know who we are, we know what we're about, we know what our principles are, we know how our friends are, we know how our partners are. We've got a clear plan. We want to work with everybody, but we're very clear and consistent, we hope, in our communication and in the way we follow through and how we live out our values in our relationships with other nations. This investment means we can continue to meet commitments to our alliance partner, that we can play our part in particular. We are building a stronger defence force by restoring defence funding to 2% of GDP by next financial year. That will make us, by the way, the second of all the Five Eyes countries. It'll make us greater than the United Kingdom. It'll make it also greater than Japan, and it'll also make us greater than Germany. And we have embarked on the largest restoration and regeneration of our Navy since the Second World War, investing $90 billion to invest in 57 new vessels, built mainly in Australia, if not all. And this is part of a broader $200 billion defence capability upgrade that we're doing. And we rely on the United States for a large share of this equipment. Australia spends over $4.4 billion on US military hardware annually, and that's more than $12 million per day Australian. And it means we're one of America's most interoperable allies, and most trusted, I would say also. We are modernising our national infrastructure to ensure our economy is even more efficient and more productive. We're investing $100 billion in nation-building infrastructure over the next decade. That's a plan that others can invest in as well. The plan will bust congestion, improve the lives of Australians, speed up supply chains and ensure our products reach global markets on time. And we're building new inland rail network and a new airport in Western Sydney. And co-located with the new airport, the new Western Sydney Metropolis will become a global hub for sectors including defence, aerospace, freight and logistics, agribusiness, pharmaceutical industries and biotechnology. And as we expand our economy and make it more productive, we will continue to be open to foreign investment. The United States is by far and away the largest source of investment in Australia and the largest destination of Australian investment. More than a quarter of all investment in Australia originated in the United States, nearly 940 billion Australian dollars. US majority-owned affiliates in Australia employ 310,000 Australians, paying nearly $30 billion in wages and salaries annually. That's why I'm here. It's about jobs. It's about wages for Australians. But it's not one-way traffic. Australian investment is in the United States also. And yesterday, with President Trump, I participated in the official opening of the new Pratt Industries manufacturing plant in Ohio, the largest new factory in the United States since President Trump was elected. And last month, BlueScope Steel, a great Australian steel company, announced a $1 billion expansion of its North Star steel mill in Delta, Ohio. Now, these projects are the practical evidence of an ever closer economic relationship between our two countries. And there'll be more, as there will be more investment from the US in Australia. So our great partnership, ladies and gentlemen, was started and cemented in the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, a presidency that left an indelible mark on America and defined its place in the world. Our shared temper of mind and our capacity for strenuous endeavour have consolidated that friendship. We think in similar ways. We share an instinct to have a go and a reflex to support those who have that go, so they get a go. It is evident in the strength of our alliance. It is evident in the strength of our shared commitment to embracing the challenges of the new global order. And it is evident in the strength of our economies and our determination to improve the lives of our peoples. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you. That was terrific. I think it's nice to start a Monday morning. It's refreshing to start a Monday morning with defiant optimism. We're not used to that these days, and it's great to have. I really appreciate everything you said about alliances, and I think it's important to know that our forces have been fighting alongside of each other for over 100 years in every single war, including for the last 18 years in Afghanistan. And that is a remarkable testament to the strength of the alliances. We have about 10 or so minutes, so I'll get right to some of the questions from the audience in a minute. First one, though, I want to get to Ohio.
Yeah.
We're in the Midwest, we're in Chicago. It's important, the trade relationship that you've mentioned between the United States and Australia is important. Where do you see the future growth potential in that relationship between the United States and Australia, and in particular, how do you see the Midwest playing in that?
Well, I think in the two examples I outlined in terms of Australia's big investments, whether it's BlueScope or what Anthony Pratt has been doing down there in Wapakoneta. There you go, I got it right this time. That speaks, I think, of the ingenuity of Australians to understand where the opportunity is. I mean, I talk about Anthony's business. I understand he's in 27 states now, but what Australia has done in the recycling of paper and the mills process and the technology that they've built there through Pratt Industries in Australia, he's basically brought that model to the United States where the level of recycling is much, much lower. So his business in Australia is probably about, it's about half, more than half the market in Australia, about 55% in the box market and recycled paper. In the United States, it's about 5%. But they have the technology and the know-how and the ability to turn that into something much greater than that. And they're doing something quite different to everybody else. But they're also doing something quite important, I think, environmentally as well. And And I think Anthony wouldn't like me to sort of describe him as a sort of an environmental warrior, although they're the outcomes that he's achieved. But his business model is just good for the environment. And that's where I think he's really merged these two things. So why am I telling this? I'm telling this story because Australians are quite innovative investors. We're developing great technology in Australia to solve some of these big challenges. My own government is going to focus very heavily on the technology around waste management. It's our waste, it's our responsibility. It's a very practical environmental objective that I want our government and our country to pursue. But it's going to create a lot of jobs too. It's going to create lower cost industries for Australia. And it's going to create a cleaner environment. So it's just win-win-win. And so where we can see those opportunities, and I think there are a lot of those across the United States, and we can bring a lot of that know-how from what we're doing in Australia here to the United States. And similarly, I think the partnerships we can have in the agricultural sector, the ag tech sector, the fintech sector, I mean, the entire Midwest, so much of its services, its primary industries and depends on this new technology. I mean, technology is going to shape a lot of the opportunities here. Farming practices are going to change. In Australia at the moment, we are going through one of the worst droughts on memory. But the resilience, but drought is not a new thing in Australia. And so our farmers have had to, by sheer necessity of the environment they live in, had to develop some of the most advanced farming practices in the world. So there's a great deal to learn off each other, and I'm sure David will be exploring all of this in his new role as consul.
You talked about China. You described China as a success, in fact, of our policy. I think most people would agree with that, but we are at a stage where there is a debate, certainly in the United States, about what the meaning of that success. So in our own opinion polling, we find a very divided public between those who think that China's emergence as a world power represents a critical threat to U.S. security, and those who say, no, actually it's something that we can deal with. How would you describe the future strategic relationship of a rising China?
Well, I think the first thing to do is sort of acknowledge that Australia and the US come at this from a different perspective. We have a trade surplus with China. You have a trade deficit, and quite a significant one. And so that, I think, is going to affect the lens through which you see China and its economic success, I suppose. From Australia's point of view, I mean, the engagement with China has been enormously beneficial to our country, and that's what led us to develop the comprehensive strategic partnership that we have with China, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which is quite revolutionary in many respects, and we want to see that continue. But that, as I was arguing in my presentation, has taken to a place where China now has a resource and capability that it never had before, and it has invested a great deal of that in its own strategic defence and its capability in that area, and that obviously presents a different calculus to the Indo-Pacific region than existed 30 years ago. And so that's why I just encourage everyone who is engaging this issue to sort of step back from it a bit and appreciate the history of what's happened here, and to have a bit of, I think, confidence and optimism that there are options and there are ways that we can manage this into the future, that the world can have two very large economies and they can be mutually beneficial. But the point is, we've got to go for the gear change now. It won't continue to work if we try and force it into the old model and the old rules and the old understandings that were there before that has led us to this point. They have served their purpose, and we now need to define a new way of this working. So that's why I've been quite supportive of the President actually trying to strike a new deal with China. There's some serious issues that have to be addressed in that trade relationship. Issues once addressed which will also benefit Australia. Issues on forced technology transfer affect Australian companies too. IP issues affect Australian companies too. And there are global responsibilities on the environment and the other things which Australia is very invested in, and everybody needs to pull their weight on that. So with great economic power comes great responsibility. So we need to step up and gear change.
You described the centrality of Australia in at least a bilateral relationship. You're probably unique, maybe together with Japan, but certainly one of the countries that has an extraordinarily important relationship with China. an extraordinarily important relationship with the United States.
True.
Is there a role for Australia, either alone or perhaps together with one or two other countries, to try to figure out a way that we can build a relationship between the United States and China that benefits both, and as a result also Australia? Is there something that you can do proactively?
Of course, and we're doing it. And part of the reason for being here, but it's also through important work through things like the East Asia Summit. The close relationship, as you rightly say, with Japan, with Indonesia, with whom we've just completed a comprehensive partnership with them, and with India also as a major and strongly emerging economy in the Indo-Pacific region. Singapore, small country, but one that is greatly respected and has, I think, very, very interesting insights into this question. Prime Minister Lee gave a very, I think, impressive overview of the issues here when he spoke at the Shangri-La conference earlier in the year. But, the thing about the Indo-Pacific, and Australia's no stranger to this either, I mean, our objective here is pretty straightforward. We just want to be ourselves. We want to be independent, sovereign nations, and to be able to get on and do what we do and run our countries the way our people choose to. And that's what is prized. And I find there to be a great complementarity of that objective amongst nations of the Indo-Pacific. We all have our different histories, we all have our different ideologies or philosophies and systems of government and all this, and this is why I'm always encouraged by the ASEAN nations, a more eclectic group of nations you couldn't find, but been working pretty closely together for 45 years. And I think that shows the attitude of the Indo-Pacific. And that's why ASEAN has always been very much at the centre of how we look at the Indo-Pacific. We enjoy that relationship. So understanding that nations in the Indo-Pacific simply want to be independent and sovereign, I think is the basis for great engagement and a coalition of positive intent.
I know we're out of time, so I'm going to ask one softball question for you, which is, and it's coming actually from our audience, this is even better. What do you believe Australia or Australians do better than any other nation, and that we in the United States should bring into this country?
What do we do better? Look, there's heaps of things we do better. And
I knew it was a difficult question. There's so many things to choose from.
Yeah, we're going to have to push our flight back. I'll tell you what's most important, I think. I think what Australia really brings to the table is we're a massively optimistic people. We're a glass half full country. We're a country that we believe has achieved amazing things, and we tend not to crow about it. We're quite understated. But we're a very strong and resilient country and proud of what we've achieved and what we're doing in the world. And most importantly, to lift living standards for our own people. We've got our challenges, as I said. The drought at the moment is breaking the nation's heart. And while I'm a long way away from home, this is something that I'm getting regular reports on, and I'm looking forward to getting home and getting out in those rural communities where they're really hurting. But despite droughts, despite floods, despite wars, despite economic challenges, despite being a long way away from the rest of the world where commerce was traded for centuries, we have prevailed and succeeded. And why? Because we have a go and we get a go. And when we do that, I think we add something very special to the world.
Mr. Prime Minister, I can't think of anything better to import than optimism, so that's a great way to end. I really appreciate your time spending here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was good.